She was shot in her own yard, left bleeding on the floor, and the men who pulled the trigger? They rode away laughing, thinking she was already dead. But Rebecca Ellers was not dead. Not yet. She was 24 years old, alone on a Kansas homestead, and the most powerful railroad company in America wanted her land. When she refused to sell, they sent 3 gunmen to change her mind. 1 bullet. That was supposed to be the end of her story. Instead, it was just the beginning. Because a stranger heard that gunshot, a drifting cowboy with nothing to lose and no reason to care. He could have kept riding. He could have minded his own business like everyone else. He did not. What happened next would bring down a corrupt corporation, send powerful men to prison, and prove that sometimes the smallest voices can shake the mightiest empires. This is a story about a woman who was supposed to die quietly. She chose to fight loudly instead. Stay with me until the end. I promise you, the revenge she gets is worth every minute. This story carries a powerful message for anyone who has ever felt powerless against forces bigger than themselves. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to stand your ground even when you are terrified. It teaches us that the people who try to make you feel small are often the ones most afraid of your strength. And most importantly, it shows us that we do not have to face our battles alone. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes a stranger becomes family. Sometimes the worst day of your life leads you to everything you never knew you needed. If you have ever been knocked down and told to stay down, this story is for you. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever had to fight for something everyone told you to give up? I would love to hear your story. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that they are stronger than they think. And if you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. We bring you powerful tales of courage, love, and justice every single week. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you back to Kansas, 1878, the night Rebecca Ellers refused to die. The gunshot echoed across the prairie like thunder on a cloudless day, shattering the peaceful silence of a warm May evening in Kansas. Rebecca Ellers stumbled backward, her hands flying instinctively to her stomach where something warm and wet was already soaking through her pale blue dress. The fabric had been her mother's favorite color, and Rebecca had worn it today because she needed courage. She needed to feel her mother's spirit with her when she faced down the men who had been threatening her for weeks. Now that same dress was turning crimson with her own blood. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Rebecca thought maybe she had imagined it. Maybe the 3 men standing in her yard, their faces hard as the Kansas bedrock, had not actually pulled the trigger. Maybe this was all some terrible nightmare she would wake from any second now, gasping and sweating in her small bed, relieved to find herself whole and unharmed. But the pain was real. So real it stole her breath and made her knees buckle beneath her. So real it sent white-hot fire racing through her entire body, radiating out from the wound in her side like ripples in a pond. She had known this day might come. Lord knows everyone in Wilson, Kansas had warned her often enough. A woman alone on a homestead was asking for trouble, they said. A woman alone refusing to sell her land to the railroad was asking for worse. The shopkeeper had told her. The preacher had told her. Even old Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring farm had pulled her aside after church one Sunday and begged her to reconsider. But Rebecca had never been the kind of woman who backed down from a fight. Not when her mother died of consumption and her father wanted to give up on everything. Not when her fiancé, Edward, abandoned her for refusing to stay in Philadelphia like a proper society lady. And certainly not when 3 strangers in dusty coats rode onto her property demanding she sign over everything her father had worked his whole life to build. William Ellers had poured his heart and soul into this land. He had cleared the fields with his own 2 hands. He had built the cabin board by board, nail by nail. He had planted every tree, dug every fence post, and dreamed every dream that this homestead represented. When pneumonia took him last winter, Rebecca had stood at his grave and promised she would never let his legacy die. Now, as blood seeped through her fingers and dripped onto the wooden porch her father had built with such pride, she wondered if her stubbornness would be the death of her after all. "You should have just signed the papers, lady." The voice belonged to a thin man with cold eyes the color of river mud. He sat on his horse, like he had done this 100 times before. Like shooting an unarmed woman in her own yard was just another Tuesday afternoon. His two companions flanked him on either side, their expressions blank and uncaring. "Ain't nobody worth dying for a worthless patch of dirt," the thin man continued, spitting tobacco juice onto the ground near Rebecca's feet. "Railroad's coming through whether you like it or not. All you had to do was take the money and walk away." Rebecca wanted to scream at him. She wanted to tell him this land was not worthless. This land was her father's dream. This land was the last piece of him she had left in this world. This land was her future, her freedom, her whole entire identity wrapped up in 160 acres of Kansas prairie. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out, except a soft, wet gasp that tasted like copper and regret. The three men exchanged glances that held no remorse, no hesitation, no humanity at all. Then they turned their horses and galloped away without looking back. They did not check to see if she was dead. They did not wait to watch her fall. They did not care about anything except completing their assignment and collecting their pay from the Southern Pacific Railroad Company. To them, she was just another obstacle that needed clearing, another name to cross off a list, another inconvenient person standing in the way of progress and profit. Rebecca watched them disappear into the vast Kansas landscape, dust clouds rising behind them like smoke from a funeral pyre. The setting sun painted everything gold and orange and purple, so achingly beautiful it seemed almost cruel. How could the world look so peaceful, so serene, so utterly indifferent when her life was draining out onto the floor? With every ounce of strength she had left, she dragged herself toward the cabin door. Her legs would not support her weight anymore. So she crawled on her hands and knees, leaving a crimson trail across the porch boards. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through her body, but she kept going. She had to get inside. She had to find something to stop the bleeding. She had to survive. Her father's revolver sat on the table just inside the door, right where she had left it this morning. She had meant to have it in her hand when she confronted the railroad men, but they had arrived faster than expected, catching her in the yard before she could arm herself. Now she reached for it with trembling, blood-slicked fingers. The gun clattered to the floor and skidded just out of reach. The irony was not lost on her, even through the haze of pain and approaching darkness. She had survived the journey west when half their wagon train died of cholera along the trail. She had survived the first winter in Kansas when temperatures dropped so low the chickens froze solid in their coop and ice formed on the inside of the cabin walls. She had survived her father's death from pneumonia just 6 months ago, when the grief felt like it might swallow her whole and drag her down into the earth alongside him. And now she was going to die because she refused to sign a piece of paper, because she was too stubborn to surrender, because she loved her father's memory more than she feared these men and their threats. The edges of her vision were going dark now, closing in like curtains at the end of a play. She pressed her hands harder against the wound in her side, but the blood kept coming, warm and relentless and impossible to stop. It pooled beneath her on the wooden floor, spreading slowly like spilled molasses, soaking into the boards her father had laid with such care and attention. She thought about her mother, dead these 10 years now, taken by the consumption that had ravaged her lungs until she could barely whisper goodbye. She thought about her father, buried on the hill overlooking the north pasture, where he had always said the sunsets were prettiest. She wondered if they would be waiting for her, wherever she was going. She wondered if they would be disappointed that she had failed to protect their dream. The sound of approaching hooves made her heart seize with fresh terror. They were coming back to finish what they started. Coming back to make sure she would never testify against them, never identify them to the sheriff, never cause any more trouble for the mighty Southern Pacific Railroad. Rebecca tried to crawl toward the fallen revolver, but her arms would not obey her commands anymore. Her body felt heavy and cold, like she was sinking into deep water, like the earth itself was pulling her down into its embrace. She could hear the horse stopping outside, hear boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud, hear footsteps crossing the porch toward the open door. This was it, then. This was how it ended. Not with a fight, but with a whimper. Not standing tall, but lying in a pool of her own blood, helpless as a newborn calf. The door pushed open wider, letting in the last golden rays of sunlight. "Miss?" "Oh, good Lord." The voice was deep and unfamiliar. Definitely not one of the men who had shot her. A stranger. A tall stranger with broad shoulders and a wide-brimmed hat, silhouetted against the dying light of day. His face was in shadow, but his voice carried genuine shock and concern. "They want my land," Rebecca whispered, because it seemed important that someone know. Someone should understand why she was dying. Someone should remember what the railroad had done. It was the last thing she said before the darkness swallowed her whole. Garrett Reeves had been trailing a small herd of cattle north toward Abilene when he heard the gunshot echo across the empty prairie. 10 years working cattle drives across the frontier had taught him many lessons, chief among them being to mind his own business. Out here, where the law was whatever a man with a gun decided it was, getting involved in other people's problems was a good way to end up dead yourself. Smart cowboys kept their heads down, did their jobs, and rode past trouble without a second glance. But something about that single shot troubled him in a way he could not explain. It came from the direction of a small homestead he had passed earlier that morning. A tidy little cabin with a vegetable garden and a pen full of chickens scratching contentedly in the dirt. He had noticed the laundry hanging on the line to dry in the warm spring breeze. Women's clothes, a dress, some undergarments, signs of someone living alone. Against every instinct that had kept him alive these past 10 years, he turned his horse toward the sound. What he found made his stomach turn and his blood run cold. The woman lay crumpled on the cabin floor like a rag doll someone had thrown aside, surrounded by a spreading pool of blood that reflected the fading daylight like a dark mirror. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with hair the color of autumn leaves spread around her head like a fiery halo. Her skin had gone white as fresh milk, making the freckles across her nose and cheeks stand out in stark contrast. Her dress, which might have been a pretty pale blue once, was now soaked crimson from a wound in her side. Her breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that told Garrett she was still alive, but barely. If he did not act fast, she would not be alive for much longer. He moved without thinking, falling back on instincts honed by years of necessity. 10 years on the trail meant he had seen his share of gunshot wounds. He had lost friends to bullets and infection, and sheer bad luck in towns with names he had already forgotten. But he had also learned how to keep people alive when the nearest doctor was days away and hope was in short supply. He grabbed clean cloths from the washstand in the corner and pressed them hard against her wound, ignoring the blood that immediately soaked through and stained his hands. The bleeding was bad, worse than he had first thought, but not as bad as it could have been. From what he could tell, the bullet seemed to have passed through her side without hitting anything vital. A lucky shot, if you could call getting shot lucky at all. "Stay with me, miss," he murmured, though he was not sure she could hear him. "You hang on now. You're going to be all right." He worked through the night as the sun set and the stars emerged and the moon rose over the silent prairie. He did everything his grandmother had taught him before she died, back when he was just a boy in Tennessee, who never imagined he would end up here in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, trying to save a stranger's life. Grandma Reeves had been a healer in their mountain community, the woman people came to when the doctor was too far away or too expensive or simply not available. She had taught Garrett about herbs and poultices, about cleaning wounds and fighting infection, about the thin line between life and death, and how sometimes all you could do was hold someone's hand and hope for the best. He cleaned the wound with boiled water and what little whiskey he found in the cabin. He packed it with dried yarrow and comfrey leaves he recognized hanging from the rafters. Herbs the woman must have gathered herself for just such emergencies. He bandaged it tight with strips torn from a clean sheet, praying his work would be enough. And through it all, he talked to her. He told her about the cattle he was driving north, about the long, dusty trail from Texas, about the stars he had slept under and the rivers he had crossed. He told her about his grandmother and her healing ways, about his mother who used to sing hymns while she worked, about the little farm in Tennessee that existed now only in his memories. He did not know why he kept talking. Maybe because the silence felt too much like death, too much like giving up. Maybe because he wanted her to have something to hold on to in the darkness, some thread of human connection that might guide her back to the living. Or maybe because there was something about this woman, something fierce and stubborn in the set of her jaw, even unconscious, that made him want to keep her in this world. Whatever the reason, he talked until his voice went hoarse, and the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the horizon. And then, like a miracle he had not dared hope for, her fever broke. Her eyes fluttered open, green as spring grass after rain, and fixed on him with confusion and alarm. She tried to move, tried to sit up, and gasped at the pain that shot through her body. "Easy now," Garrett said quickly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "You are safe. I am not with those men who shot you." "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice weak but sharp as a blade. Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the bloody cloths, the makeshift bandages, this stranger sitting beside her bed. "Why are you here?" Garrett introduced himself calmly, keeping his distance so he would not frighten her any further. He explained about hearing the gunshot while trailing his cattle north, about following the sound against his better judgment, about finding her bleeding on the floor, and spending the night trying to keep her alive. "I did what I could for your wound," he finished. "Bullet passed clean through, far as I can tell. You lost a lot of blood, but I think you're going to make it if we can keep infection from setting in." Rebecca stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if she could trust this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and saved her life. Finally, she accepted the cup of water he offered, drinking slowly with trembling hands. "Thank you," she said cautiously, the words seeming to cost her something. "I am Rebecca. Rebecca Ellers. Pleased to meet you, Miss Ellers. Though I surely wish it were under better circumstances than these." "Those men," Rebecca said, and Garrett watched her jaw tighten with anger even through the pain. "Southern Pacific Railroad. They want my land for their tracks. I refused to sell, so they came to change my mind with bullets instead of money." Garrett's expression darkened at her words. "Shooting an unarmed woman is not exactly standard business practice, not even for the railroads." Rebecca laughed bitterly, then winced at the pain it caused her. "It is out here, Mr. Reeves. My father died last winter, and they have been circling like vultures ever since. They think because I am a woman alone, I will be easy to intimidate, or easy to kill." Garrett studied her for a long moment, taking in the determination in her eyes, the stubborn set of her chin, the way she held herself despite being wounded and weak and facing impossible odds. "Well," he said finally, "they surely miscalculated on that count." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or respect, or the beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. Here was a man who had saved her life without asking anything in return, without knowing who she was or what her land was worth. Here was a woman who had stared death in the face and refused to blink, who would rather die than surrender her father's legacy to men who saw nothing but dollar signs, where she saw home. "They will come back," Rebecca said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "When they realize I survived, they will come back to finish what they started." "I expect they will," Garrett agreed. "And I have no one, no family left, no help coming." She squared her shoulders despite the pain radiating from her wound, lifting her chin with a defiance that made something stir in Garrett's chest. "But this is my home. My father built it with his own two hands. I will not be driven from it by railroad thugs and corporate greed." Garrett studied her for a long moment, thinking about all the reasons he should saddle up and ride away. His cattle were waiting to be driven north. His buyer in Abilene was expecting him within the month. His two hired hands could only manage the herd alone for so long before things started going wrong. But then he thought about what would happen to this woman if he left. How long would she survive out here alone, wounded and vulnerable, with the railroad determined to take her land one way or another? "I could stay," he said slowly, surprising himself with the words, "just until you are back on your feet. Help you keep watch for when they return." Rebecca's eyes widened with genuine surprise. "I could not ask that of a stranger. You do not even know me." "You did not ask, I am offering." Garrett moved to the window and looked out at the prairie stretching golden and endless in the morning light. "Because it is the right thing to do. And because I have seen what happens when good people do nothing in the face of injustice." He turned back to face her, his expression serious but kind. "World has enough cowards already. I do not aim to add myself to that number." Rebecca stared at him for a long moment, emotions warring across her pale face. She had spent her whole life learning not to depend on anyone but herself, learning that people left or died or disappointed you in the end, learning that trust was a luxury she could not afford. But there was something in this stranger's eyes that made her want to believe, something steady and true that she had not seen in a very long time, something that whispered, maybe, just maybe, not everyone would let her down. "All right," she said finally, "just until I'm back on my feet." Garrett nodded and allowed himself a small smile. Just until then. Neither of them knew it yet, but those 4 words would change both their lives forever. The first week after the shooting passed in a blur of fever and fitful sleep for Rebecca. There were times when she did not know if she was dreaming or awake, times when the pain in her side seemed distant and unreal, times when she could have sworn she heard her father's voice telling her to hold on, to fight, to survive. She drifted in and out of consciousness like a leaf on a slow-moving river, sometimes surfacing long enough to see the stranger's face hovering over her, his expression worried but determined. He was always there when she opened her eyes, always checking her bandages, always spooning water or broth between her cracked lips, always talking to her in that low, steady voice that seemed to anchor her to the world of the living. In her more lucid moments, Rebecca found herself watching him through half-closed eyes. Garrett Reeves moved through her cabin like he had always belonged there, quiet and efficient and surprisingly gentle for such a big man. He fed the chickens and gathered the eggs each morning. He milked the cow and fixed the fence where it had sagged under winter snow. He cooked meals that were simple but filling, game he hunted on her land and vegetables from her garden, and he never complained about the small space or the hard work or the danger he had placed himself in by staying. At night, he slept outside under the stars, giving her privacy and preserving her reputation, even though there was no one around to witness any impropriety. Rebecca heard him sometimes through the thin cabin walls, pacing the perimeter of her property, keeping watch for any sign of the railroad men returning. She did not know what to make of him. In her experience, men did not do things without expecting something in return. Her fiancé Edward had certainly expected plenty. A docile wife who would stay in Philadelphia and host dinner parties and bear his children while he built his law practice. The men in Wilson, who had shown interest after her father died, had been transparently interested in her land more than her person. But Garrett seemed to want nothing except to see her well. It was confusing. It was unsettling. It was, if she was being honest with herself, more than a little bit wonderful. On the 4th day after the shooting, Rebecca insisted on getting out of bed. Her wound still ached fiercely and her legs felt weak as a newborn foal's, but she could not stand to lie there helpless for another minute. She had always been a woman of action, and this forced inactivity was driving her slowly mad. She found Garrett in the yard, splitting firewood with powerful, efficient strokes of the axe. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of hard labor. Sweat gleamed on his skin in the afternoon sun, and she caught herself watching longer than was proper before he noticed her standing in the doorway. "Should you be up?" he asked, setting down the axe immediately and crossing the yard toward her. His brow furrowed with concern as he took in her pale face and the way she leaned against the doorframe for support. "I cannot lie in that bed another minute. I will go completely mad." Garrett smiled at that, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and transformed his serious face into something almost handsome. "I figured you for the restless type, Miss Ellers." "Rebecca," she corrected automatically. "You saved my life and have been sleeping in my yard for 4 days. I think we are past the formality of Miss Ellers." "Rebecca, then." He tested the name like he was tasting something new, and she felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest at the sound of it on his lips. They settled into a routine after that first day she ventured out of bed. Garrett continued to handle the heavy work around the homestead while Rebecca slowly took on lighter tasks as her strength returned. She could not do much with her wound still healing. The stitches Garrett had improvised pulling painfully whenever she moved too quickly. But she insisted on cooking meals and mending clothes, and doing whatever small things made her feel less like an invalid. The evenings quickly became her favorite time of day. After the work was done and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, they would find themselves on the porch together, watching the sky transform from blue to gold to purple to the deep velvet black of a prairie night. The air would cool as darkness fell, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh-cut grass. Fireflies would emerge from the tall grass, blinking their tiny lights like earthbound stars, and they would talk about everything and nothing at all. Garrett told her about Tennessee, about the little farm where he had grown up nestled in a green valley between 2 mountains that seemed to touch the sky. He spoke of his mother, a devout woman who sang hymns while she worked in the kitchen, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of kneading bread or stirring soup. He remembered his father as a quiet, steady man who could coax crops from the most stubborn soil, and always knew when the rain was coming just by the ache in his bones. And he told her about Thomas, his younger brother, just 15 when the war started, who had lied about his age to follow Garrett into the Confederate Army because he could not stand to be left behind. Thomas, with his easy laugh and his dreams of seeing the ocean someday. Thomas, who had caught a bullet at Shiloh and died in Garrett's arms before he ever got the chance. "They are all gone now," Garrett said one evening, his voice distant with old grief. His eyes were fixed on the darkening horizon, seeing something far beyond the Kansas prairie. "Parents died of fever in '63 when I was still off fighting a war I did not really believe in." Thomas. He paused and Rebecca saw his jaw tighten. "I came west after that because there was nothing left for me back there. Nothing but ghosts and graves and memories that hurt too much to hold on to." Rebecca's heart ached for him, for the young man who had lost everything and chosen to run rather than face the ruins of his life. "I am sorry," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm without thinking about it. "I know what it is to lose everyone you love." Garrett turned to look at her, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared pain, of kindred suffering. "Your father," he said. "He and my mother before him." Rebecca let her hand fall back to her lap, suddenly aware of how forward the touch had been. "And my fiancé, though that was a different kind of loss entirely." Garrett raised an eyebrow, a hint of curiosity breaking through his somber expression. "Fiancé?" His name was Edward. She smiled ruefully at the memory of the man she had once thought she would marry. "We were engaged before my father decided to leave Philadelphia and come west. Edward expected me to stay behind, of course. He wanted a proper society wife who would host tea parties and charity events and look beautiful on his arm at legal functions. He did not understand why I would choose a dusty homestead in Kansas over everything he had to offer. And you chose the homestead. I chose my father." Rebecca looked out at the land stretching before them, the land her father had poured his heart into, the land she had nearly died defending. This was his dream, you see, building something from nothing. Proving everyone wrong who said it could not be done, that the soil was too poor and the weather too harsh and the isolation too complete. She paused, feeling the familiar ache of grief that never quite went away. "I was not about to let him do it alone, no matter what Edward or anyone else thought about it. Garrett was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Sounds like your father was a good man. The best man I ever knew. Rebecca's voice caught slightly, and she had to swallow past the lump in her throat. He believed in this land even when no one else did. He believed in me even when I was difficult and headstrong and insisted on doing everything my own way. I suspect that last part has not changed much. Rebecca laughed despite herself, despite the grief and the pain and the danger still lurking on the horizon. No, I suppose it has not. The second week brought warmer days and longer conversations as spring settled fully over the Kansas prairie. Rebecca learned that Garrett had taught himself to read from a stolen Bible during the war, spending long hours by firelight, puzzling out the words while his comrades slept. He still carried that same Bible in his saddlebag everywhere he went, its pages worn soft as cloth from years of handling, its margins filled with notes in his careful, self-taught handwriting. She learned that he had a gift for working with animals, a gentle patience that made even the most skittish horse calm under his hands. He spoke to them softly while he worked, murmuring reassurances and praise, and Rebecca found herself charmed by the tender way he handled her cantankerous old mule, who had bitten every other person who tried to approach him. She learned that he had once walked 20 miles in pouring rain to return a lost dog to its owner, a little girl whose tears had broken his heart. He learned that she had planted every tree on the property with her own hands, that she had names for all her chickens even though she knew she shouldn't, and that she still cried every time she had to slaughter one for dinner. They were two people who had learned to survive alone, who had built walls around their hearts to keep out any further pain. But somehow, in the quiet evenings on that small porch, those walls were beginning to crumble. One morning, near the end of the second week, Rebecca woke to find Garrett repairing the roof of the chicken coop. He had discovered a small leak she had not even noticed, and was patching it carefully with scraps of wood and a determination that made her smile. "You do not have to do all this, you know," she called out to him from the porch. Her wound was healing well now, the stitches starting to itch in that way that meant new skin was forming underneath. The railroad men might never come back. They might have decided I am not worth the trouble. Garrett climbed down from the ladder and wiped his hands on his trousers, leaving dusty streaks across the worn fabric. He crossed the yard to where she stood, his expression unreadable. "Your wound is nearly healed," he said carefully. "You are getting stronger every day." He paused, and something flickered in his eyes that she could not quite name. "Are you saying you want me to leave?" The question hung in the air between them like morning mist over the prairie. Rebecca opened her mouth to say yes. That was exactly what she was saying. That she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself now. That she did not need anyone. Certainly not some drifting cowboy who would ride away as soon as the next cattle drive called. That she had survived alone before he came and she would survive alone after he left. But the words would not come. Because the truth was, she did not want him to leave. The truth was, she had grown used to hearing his voice in the mornings, to sharing meals across her small table, to sitting beside him in the quiet evenings while the fireflies danced. The truth was, she had started looking forward to his smile, rare as it was, and the sound of his laugh, rarer still. The truth was, for the first time since her father died, she did not feel alone. "No," she said finally, the words surprising both of them. "I am not saying that." Garrett nodded slowly, and something warm flickered in his eyes. "Good. Because I have been thinking I might stay a bit longer, if you do not mind." He gestured vaguely toward the property. "There is still work that needs doing. That fence in the north pasture is about to fall over, and the barn could use a new coat of whitewash. I do not mind." They stood there for a moment in the morning sunshine, looking at each other, neither willing to name what was growing between them. Then Garrett cleared his throat and gestured toward the garden, breaking the spell. "Those tomatoes are looking ready to pick. You want me to bring some in for dinner? That would be nice." He walked away toward the garden, and Rebecca pressed her hand against her chest where her heart was beating much too fast for such a simple conversation. This was dangerous, she told herself. Caring about someone was dangerous. People left. People died. People disappointed you when you needed them most. She had learned that lesson too many times to forget it now. But watching Garrett's broad back as he moved through her garden, treating her plants with the same gentle care he showed everything else, Rebecca wondered if maybe, just maybe, some people were worth the risk. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, Garrett finally gave voice to what had been hovering between them for days. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the last traces of sunset were fading into purple. "I have been on the move for 10 years now, never stayed anywhere longer than a few months, never wanted to. Wandering felt easier than staying still. Staying still meant having time to think, time to remember, time to feel all those things I was running from." "And now?" Rebecca asked, her heart suddenly pounding. "And now?" He turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his face stole her breath. "Now I find myself not wanting to leave this place, not wanting to leave you, Garrett." She did not know what to say, what to feel. Part of her wanted to run, to protect herself, to push him away before he could hurt her. But another part, a part that had been sleeping for a very long time, wanted to lean into this feeling, to let herself fall. "I know this is sudden," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we have only known each other a couple of weeks. I am not asking for promises or declarations or anything like that." He reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against hers. "I am just asking for a chance to see where this goes, a chance to be here, with you, building something that matters." Rebecca looked down at their joined hands, feeling the steady beat of her heart, the warmth spreading through her chest. She thought about her father, about how he had taken a chance on this land when everyone said he would fail. She thought about her mother, about how she had followed her husband west even though it terrified her. She thought about all the reasons she had to be afraid. And then she thought about how lonely she had been since her father died. How empty the cabin felt when she woke up in the middle of the night. How much she had come to cherish these evenings on the porch with a man who listened when she spoke and looked at her like she was something precious. "I am scared," she whispered finally. "I know." Garrett squeezed her hand gently. "I am scared too, but I have been running from everything for 10 years and I am tired of it. For once in my life, I want to stay and see what happens." Rebecca took a deep breath, feeling like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into unknown waters. "All right," she said. "We will see where this goes." Garrett smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds after a long, dark winter. "That is all I ask." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, hands still intertwined, watching the moon rise over the prairie. Neither of them spoke of love. Neither of them made grand declarations or impossible promises. But something had shifted between them, something fundamental and irreversible. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Rebecca felt hope blooming in her chest like wildflowers after spring rain. And for the first time in 10 years, Garrett felt like he might finally have found a place worth staying. But peace, as they would soon discover, was not meant to last. The railroad was not finished with Rebecca Ellers. And the next time they came, they would not be sending hired guns. They would be sending something much worse. The morning started like any other on the Ellers homestead. Rebecca fed the chickens while Garrett walked the fence line, checking for any signs of damage from the previous night's windstorm. The summer sun was already hot despite the early hour, promising another scorching Kansas afternoon. Heat waves shimmered on the horizon, making the distant hills seem to dance and waver like reflections in disturbed water. 3 weeks had passed since the shooting, and Rebecca's wound had healed well enough that she could do most of her regular chores without too much pain. The scar would be with her forever, a puckered reminder of how close she had come to dying, but she wore it like a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. She had almost convinced herself that maybe the railroad had given up. Maybe shooting a woman had been too much even for them. Maybe the scandal of what they had done had made the Southern Pacific executives reconsider their methods. Maybe she and Garrett could just exist here on this little patch of prairie, building something together without the constant fear of violence hanging over their heads. She should have known better. The sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful morning like a rock thrown through a window. Rebecca's blood turned to ice in her veins. She dropped the feed bucket, scattering grain across the yard as she ran toward the cabin, her healing wound protesting with every jolting step. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her teeth, in her fingertips, in every inch of her body. Garrett was already sprinting from the north pasture, having heard the hoofbeats from wherever he had been working. His face was grim and determined, his hand already moving toward the revolver at his hip. "How many?" he asked as they met at the porch steps, both of them breathing hard. Rebecca shaded her eyes against the sun and counted the riders coming up the path toward her cabin. 3. Same as before. The same 3 men who had shot her and left her for dead. "Get inside," Garrett said, his voice low and commanding. "Take my rifle from above the fireplace. I will try to reason with them, but be ready for anything." "I am not hiding inside while you face them alone," Rebecca protested, even as fear coiled in her stomach like a nest of snakes. "Rebecca." He grabbed her shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. "You are still healing. You cannot fire a weapon accurately while favoring that wound. Let me handle this. I promise I will not let anything happen to you." She wanted to argue. Every fiber of her being screamed against cowering inside while someone else fought her battles. This was her land, her fight, her life on the line. But she could see the sense in his words, even if she hated admitting it. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "But if anything happens to you, I swear on my father's grave, I am coming out shooting anyway." Garrett smiled despite the tension crackling in the air. "I would expect nothing less from you." Rebecca retrieved the rifle and positioned herself just inside the cabin door, where she could see and hear everything that happened in the yard. Through the narrow gap, she watched the 3 riders approach at a leisurely pace, like they had all the time in the world, like they were just out for a pleasant morning ride instead of coming to terrorize a woman on her own land. The thin man with cold eyes led the group, the same man who had shot her, whose face she saw every time she closed her eyes. His 2 companions flanked him on either side, their expressions blank and uncaring, their hands resting casually near their holstered weapons. Garrett stood alone in the yard, calm as still water on a windless day. His hand rested near his revolver, not threatening but clearly ready. His posture radiated quiet confidence, the stance of a man who had faced danger before and survived. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance, "what brings you back to Miss Eller's property on this fine morning?" The leader reined his horse to a stop and looked around the homestead with exaggerated surprise, taking in the repaired fences, the freshly whitewashed barn, the signs of another person's presence. "Well now," he drawled, his thin lips curving into an unpleasant smile, "did not expect to find company here. Thought the lady was supposed to be dead." He turned to his companions with mock confusion. "Did we not leave her bleeding out on the floor?" The 2 men snickered like it was the funniest joke they had ever heard. "I would watch what I say if I were you," Garrett replied, his voice gone cold as winter frost. "Confessing to attempted murder is not generally considered smart." The leader's smile flickered, but did not disappear. "And who might you be, stranger? This is railroad business. Got nothing to do with some drifter passing through. I am a friend of the lady whose hospitality you abused so thoroughly." Garrett's hand moved slightly closer to his gun. "And I am not just passing through. I am staying." The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. Rebecca could see them calculating their odds against this unexpected obstacle, weighing whether one man was worth the trouble of dealing with. "Look, friend," the leader said, his tone shifting to something almost conciliatory, "we did not come here looking for trouble. This is just business. Southern Pacific has legal rights to this land. The lady just needs to sign the papers, take the money, and walk away. Everyone goes home happy." "The lady already said no," Garrett replied evenly. "From what I understand, the railroad does not have any legal rights to a properly registered homestead. This land belonged to Miss Eller's father, legally claimed and legally improved." Your company has no claim here. The leader's expression hardened, all pretense of friendliness dropping away like a mask. Railroad does not take no for an answer, friend, especially not from some stubborn female who does not know her place. In one fluid motion, faster than Rebecca had ever seen anyone move, Garrett drew his gun and leveled it at the speaker's chest. Today, they do. The click of the hammer cocking back was the loudest sound in the suddenly silent yard. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. The horses stamped nervously, sensing the violence crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Rebecca held her breath, her finger on the trigger of Garrett's rifle, ready to fire if any of the three men reached for their weapons. The leader's hand twitched toward his holster, then stopped. He looked at Garrett, at the steady gun pointed at his heart, at the cold certainty in the cowboy's eyes. Whatever he saw there made him reconsider. "This ain't over," he spat, jerking his horse's reins. "Railroad will get this land one way or another. You cannot watch her forever. Not today, they will not." Garrett did not lower his weapon, and not tomorrow either. "Now ride out before I decide to give Miss Ellers the justice she deserves right here and now." The three men backed their horses away slowly, then turned and galloped off in a cloud of dust. Garrett kept his gun raised until they disappeared over the horizon, until the sound of their hoofbeats faded into silence. Only then did Rebecca burst out of the cabin. "Are you all right?" she demanded, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to control it. "Did they hurt you? Did they—" "I am fine." Garrett holstered his gun and turned to face her, his expression grim. "But they will be back. You heard what he said. They are not going to give up. I know." Rebecca's jaw tightened with determination, even as fear churned in her gut. "Let them come. I will be ready. We need a better plan than just waiting for them to attack again." Garrett looked out at the horizon where the men had disappeared. "I know a lawyer in Topeka, Matthew Sullivan. He has made a name for himself fighting against railroad land grabs. If anyone can help secure your legal rights to this property, it is him." Hope flickered in Rebecca's chest like a candle flame in the darkness. "You think he would take my case?" "I am certain of it, especially when he hears they resorted to shooting an unarmed woman." Garrett paused, and his expression grew more serious. "The thing is, I would need to go to Topeka to speak with him in person. It is the only way to convince him to take immediate action. And that means leaving you alone here for a few days." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. After everything that had just happened, after the terror of watching him face down three armed men, the thought of being without him was almost unbearable. But she was Rebecca Ellers. She had survived alone before. She could survive alone again. "How long?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. 4 days, maybe 5 if the weather turns bad. "I will ride as fast as I can and come straight back. I survived here alone before you came. I can manage, I know you can." Garrett reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "But after what happened today, I do not like the idea of leaving you unprotected." Rebecca squeezed his hand and forced a confident smile she did not entirely feel. "I have my father's shotgun and your lessons on improving my aim, and the Petersons are just over that ridge. I can signal them if there is trouble." Garrett still looked concerned, but he nodded reluctantly. "I will leave tomorrow at first light. The sooner I go, the sooner I can come back with help." That night they sat on the porch as usual, but the mood was different, heavier, charged with things unsaid and emotions neither of them was quite ready to voice. Rebecca watched the fireflies blink in the darkness and thought about the days ahead. 4 days alone. 4 days of jumping at every sound, of checking the horizon for riders, of sleeping with a gun beside her bed. She had done it before, of course. She had lived alone on this homestead for months after her father died, stubbornly refusing all offers of help or shelter. But that was before Garrett, before she had someone to share meals with, to talk with, to sit beside in the quiet evenings, before she had remembered what it felt like to not be alone. The morning of Garrett's departure arrived with a sense of both anticipation and anxiety. Rebecca helped him prepare for the journey, packing food and making sure his canteen was full. She checked his horse's shoes and the straps on his saddlebags. She did everything she could think of to delay the moment when he would actually ride away. At the last moment, as he was mounting up, she pressed something into his hand. It was a small, embroidered handkerchief, white cotton with her initials stitched in blue thread. Her mother had taught her the pattern years ago. "For luck," she said softly, her voice catching despite her best efforts. Garrett looked at the handkerchief, then at her, and something shifted in his expression. He tucked it carefully into his breast pocket, right over his heart. "I will be back before you know it," he promised. "And when I return, we are going to finish that conversation we started, the one about what comes next for both of us. I would like that." He leaned down from his horse and kissed her forehead, a gentle touch that made her eyes sting with sudden tears. Then he urged his horse forward and rode down the path toward the main road. Rebecca stood on the porch and watched him go until he was nothing but a speck on the horizon. Until she could not tell anymore if what she was seeing was him or just a trick of the heat waves rising from the prairie. Then she turned and walked back into her cabin to wait. The first day without Garrett stretched endlessly before Rebecca like the Kansas prairie itself. She threw herself into work to keep the worry at bay, attacking chores with a determination bordering on desperation. She weeded the garden until her hands were raw and dirt was caked under every fingernail. She scrubbed the cabin floor on her hands and knees until the wood gleamed. She reorganized the root cellar, rearranging jars of preserved vegetables and checking stores of dried meat for any sign of spoilage. When she ran out of necessary tasks, she invented new ones. She mended clothes that did not need mending. She polished her father's pocket watch until she could see her reflection in its surface. She counted every chicken twice, then counted them again just to be sure. Anything to keep her mind occupied. Anything to stop herself from watching the horizon every 5 minutes, waiting for riders to appear. The first day passed slowly but without incident. When night fell, Rebecca barred the door and loaded both the shotgun and the rifle, placing them within easy reach of her bed. She lay awake for hours, listening to every sound outside, every rustle of wind through the grass, every distant coyote howl. Every noise seemed to carry a threat. She finally fell asleep sometime after midnight, exhausted in body and mind, and dreamed of gunshots and blood on a pale blue dress. The second day brought a thunderstorm that rolled in from the west like an army on the march. Rebecca watched the dark clouds gather on the horizon, piling higher and higher until they blotted out the sun. Lightning cracked across the sky in jagged white lines, followed seconds later by thunder that shook the walls of the cabin. Rain came down in sheets so thick she could barely see the barn just 20 yards away. She sat by the window and watched the storm rage, thinking about Garrett somewhere out there on the trail. Was he safe? Had he found shelter before the worst of it hit? Was he huddled under some rocky overhang, cold and wet and miserable, regretting ever stopping to help a stubborn woman on a Kansas homestead? The storm lasted most of the day, finally tapering off to a gentle drizzle as evening approached. Rebecca stepped outside to check for damage and found a branch had fallen on the chicken coop, tearing a hole in the roof Garrett had just repaired. She spent the remaining daylight hours fixing it, grateful for something to occupy her hands and mind. That night, she dreamed of Garrett's smile and woke up with tears on her cheeks. The third day dawned clear and bright, washed clean by the previous day's storm. Rebecca was collecting eggs from the henhouse, her basket already half full, when she heard the sound she had been dreading since Garrett rode away. Horses, multiple horses, coming up the path to her cabin. For one wild, hopeful moment, she thought it might be Garrett returning early, his mission accomplished faster than expected. But as she peered around the corner of the henhouse, her heart plummeted into her stomach. 5 riders crested the hill. Not 3 this time. 5. And leading them was a man she had never seen before, heavy-set and flashy, wearing a fancy vest with a gold watch chain glinting in the morning sun. His smile was wide and false, the kind of smile a snake might wear if snakes could smile. Rebecca dropped the egg basket without a thought, hearing shells crack as she sprinted for the cabin. Her wound ached with the sudden movement, but she ignored it, focused only on reaching the shotgun before these men reached her. She made it inside with seconds to spare, grabbing the weapon from its place by the door and positioning herself on the porch with her back against the cabin wall. Her hands were shaking, but she steadied the gun and pointed it at the lead rider as he dismounted and approached. "Miss Ellers!" The heavy man removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy, revealing slicked-back hair and small, calculating eyes. "Name is Virgil Hawkins. I represent the Southern Pacific Railroad. I understand there has been some misunderstanding about your property." "No misunderstanding." Rebecca was proud that her voice came out steady despite the terror clawing at her insides. "I am not selling. Your men made that abundantly clear when they shot me and left me for dead." Hawkins pressed a hand to his chest in a theatrical display of shock. "Shot you?" "My dear lady, I assure you the railroad would never authorize such brutality." He shook his head sadly. "If some overzealous individuals took matters into their own hands, they were certainly not acting on our behalf. The company deeply regrets any distress you may have experienced. Save your lies and your false sympathy for someone who might believe them." Rebecca tightened her grip on the shotgun. "I know exactly what the railroad wants, and exactly how far you will go to get it. Now get off my land." Hawkins' friendly facade slipped slightly, revealing something cold and hard underneath. "Miss Ellers, be reasonable. We are prepared to offer fair compensation. More than fair, actually, given the remote nature of your property and its limited agricultural potential. This land is not for sale at any price. Everything is for sale at some price, my dear." Hawkins's smile returned, but it had an edge to it now. "The question is simply how much pain you want to endure before accepting the inevitable." He gestured to his 4 companions, who began spreading out around the property, like wolves circling a wounded deer. They moved casually, hands near their weapons, making a show of examining the barn, the chicken coop, the garden that Rebecca had tended so carefully. "We will need to conduct a survey of the land," Hawkins continued smoothly. "Railroad has certain rights of way that must be assessed. I am sure you understand." "You have no rights on my property," Rebecca said, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Leave now, or I will make you leave." Hawkins laughed, an ugly sound that made her skin crawl. "A woman alone against 5 men? I admire your spirit, Miss Ellers. Truly I do. But spirit will not stop bullets, and it certainly will not stop progress." His expression hardened. "The railroad is coming through here whether you like it or not. The only question is whether you will be alive to see it. She is not alone." The voice came from behind the railroad men, causing all of them to spin around in surprise. Rebecca's heart nearly stopped, then started again at triple speed. Garrett sat on his horse at the edge of the yard, rifle in hand, and pointed directly at Virgil Hawkins' chest. Behind him rode 3 other men, their faces grim and purposeful. One wore a badge that gleamed silver in the morning light. One carried a leather case and had the look of a lawyer about him, educated and sharp. The third was older and weathered, with surveyor's tools strapped to his saddle. Garrett had brought reinforcements. Garrett had come back for her. "Sheriff Miller of Wilson County," Garrett announced, nodding toward the badge wearer. "He is very interested to hear about your surveying purposes, Hawkins, especially after what happened to Miss Ellers a few weeks back." The sheriff urged his horse forward, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "These men giving you trouble, Miss Ellers?" Rebecca lowered her shotgun slightly, relief flooding through her so intensely she felt dizzy. "They were just leaving." Hawkins's face had gone pale, his oily confidence evaporating like morning dew. "This is absurd. The railroad has agreements with the territorial government. You have no authority here." The man with the leather case dismounted and approached with calm deliberation. "Virgil Hawkins," he said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. "I thought I might find you here. Matthew Sullivan, attorney at law." He reached into his case and produced a document. "I have in my possession a federal injunction preventing Southern Pacific from any further harassment of Miss Ellers or attempts to seize her property. This injunction remains in effect pending a full legal review of your company's activities in this territory." Hawkins sputtered with rage. "You cannot do this. The railroad has invested millions in this route, which does not give you the right to shoot innocent women or steal legally registered homesteads." Sullivan's smile was thin and sharp as a blade. "Now, shall I have Sheriff Miller serve you formally, or will you and your men vacate Miss Eller's property immediately?" For a long, tense moment, Rebecca thought Hawkins might actually try to fight. His face was purple with fury, his hands clenched at his sides. His men looked to him for guidance, uncertain and increasingly nervous. But then Hawkins looked around at the armed men surrounding him, at the sheriff's badge, at the lawyer's documents, at the cold promise of consequence in every face. Whatever calculation he made behind those small, calculating eyes, the answer was clear. "This is not over," he growled as he mounted his horse. "Actually," Sullivan replied pleasantly, "I believe it is. Any further attempts to intimidate Miss Ellers will result in criminal charges. And given what I have already documented about your company's activities, those charges will stick." He tilted his head. "Have a pleasant ride back to wherever you came from, Mr. Hawkins. I suggest you start looking for new employment." The railroad men retreated, their horses' hooves raising dust as they fled down the path. Rebecca watched them go, hardly daring to believe it was really happening. Only when they had disappeared over the horizon, only when the sound of their departure had faded completely, did she finally lower the shotgun. Her arms were shaking. Her whole body was shaking. Garrett dismounted and crossed the yard in 3 long strides. And then he was there, right in front of her, real and solid and safe. Without thinking, she threw herself into his arms, pressing her face against his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her cheek. "You came back," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. His arms tightened around her. "I promised I would." The evening after the confrontation was quiet and tender. Matthew Sullivan stayed to explain the legal situation in detail while the sheriff and surveyor returned to town to begin their official work. Sullivan sat at Rebecca's small kitchen table, documents spread before him, his expression serious but encouraging. "The injunction I secured will protect your property while we build a case against Southern Pacific," he said, tapping one of the papers with his finger. "What they have done here, the intimidation, the shooting, the fraudulent claims, it is not unique. The railroad has been using these tactics across the territory. Dozens of small farmers and homesteaders have been pressured into selling at far below market value or simply driven off their land entirely." Rebecca listened intently, her hand clasped in Garrett's beneath the table. "And you can stop them?" "I can try." Sullivan leaned back in his chair. "What makes your case special, Miss Ellers, is that they escalated to actual violence. Shooting an unarmed woman changes everything. If we can get those 3 men who attacked you to testify against their employers, we might be able to expose the whole rotten system." "You think they would turn on the railroad?" Garrett asked skeptically. Sullivan smiled grimly. "Amazing what people will do to avoid prison time. The sheriff has already sent deputies to track them down. Faced with serious criminal charges, I suspect at least one of them will be eager to make a deal." They talked long into the evening, going over documents and strategies and possibilities. Sullivan explained that John Tucker, the surveyor, had confirmed that her father's original claim was legally sound and properly registered. The railroad's assertions of right-of-way were pure fabrication, designed to confuse and intimidate. "They were counting on you being too scared or too dead to fight back," Sullivan said bluntly as he packed his documents away. "People like that do not expect anyone to stand up to them. They do not expect consequences." After Sullivan left to find lodging at the boarding house in town, Rebecca and Garrett found themselves alone for the first time since his return. They stepped outside onto the porch where they had spent so many evenings, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "You really brought an army back with you," Rebecca said softly, leaning against the porch rail. "I brought what you needed." "How did you convince Sullivan to come so quickly? You said it might take a week to arrange everything." Garrett shifted closer to her, his shoulder brushing hers. I told him about you, about what happened, and I may have mentioned that I was not going to wait around in Topeka while you faced the railroad alone, that I would ride back with or without legal protection and deal with them myself if necessary. Rebecca turned to look at him, her heart swelling with emotion. What exactly did you tell him about me? The truth. Garrett met her eyes steadily. That I found a woman worth fighting for. That her land mattered because she mattered. That I would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Garrett, Rebecca began, but he held up a hand. I know what you are going to say. That it is too soon. That we barely know each other. That you have been hurt before, and you are scared to trust again. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. All of that is true. But here is what else is true. He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his calloused palms gentle against her cheeks. When I left Tennessee, I thought I would never feel at home anywhere again. I thought that part of me died with my family, with Thomas, with everything I lost in that war. For 10 years I have been wandering, telling myself I was free, but really I was just running away from the fact that I had nothing left to stay for. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch so tender it made her want to weep. But being here with you, it feels like coming home. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I do not want to run. I do not want to leave. I want to stay and build something. I want to fight for something. He paused. I want to fight for you. Rebecca's throat tightened with emotion. I am scared, she whispered. I know. So am I. We can be scared together. And then, slowly and deliberately, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned in and kissed her. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative. Two people who had been alone for so long, learning how to reach for someone else. But then Rebecca's hands came up to grip his shoulders, pulling him closer, and the kiss deepened into something that made her forget about railroads and land disputes and all the darkness that had touched her life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said quietly. I know it is fast. I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life. Rebecca closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. For so long she had kept her heart locked away, protected behind walls of independence and self-reliance. For so long she had convinced herself that needing someone was weakness, that depending on another person only led to pain when they inevitably left. But looking at this man who had saved her life, who had fought for her home, who had ridden hard across the prairie to bring her justice, she realized that needing someone was not weakness at all. It was strength. It was choosing to be vulnerable when every instinct screamed to hide. It was trusting that some people were worth the risk. I love you too, she whispered. Garrett's smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie after a long, dark night. Then I guess we better figure out how to build a life together. I guess we better. They kissed again, softer this time, a promise sealed between them beneath the vast Kansas sky. Above their heads, the stars wheeled slowly through the darkness, the same stars that had watched over this land for thousands of years, the same stars that would watch over the Reeves family for generations to come. But neither of them knew that yet. All they knew was that they had found each other. And for now, that was enough. The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and hard work and love that deepened with every passing day. Matthew Sullivan proved to be every bit as formidable as Garrett had promised. He built a meticulous case against Southern Pacific, documenting every instance of intimidation and fraud across the territory. He interviewed dozens of farmers who had been pressured into selling their land. He gathered bills of sale that showed laughably low prices for valuable property. He compiled evidence of threats and violence that painted a picture of systematic corporate corruption. The three men who had shot Rebecca were arrested by Sheriff Miller's deputies within a week of the confrontation at the homestead. Faced with serious criminal charges, including attempted murder, They quickly turned on their employers in exchange for lighter sentences. Their testimony was damning beyond anything Sullivan had hoped for. They named names, they produced documents. They described meetings where railroad executives had explicitly ordered them to use whatever means necessary to clear small landowners from the proposed route. They detailed bribes paid to local officials, survey markers that had been moved to invalidate legitimate claims, and a systematic campaign of terror designed to drive honest people off their land. The scandal made newspapers across the territory and beyond. Headlines screamed about corporate greed and railroad corruption. Editorials demanded justice for the farmers who had been victimized. Politicians who had been silent suddenly found their voices calling for investigations and reforms. Rebecca was called to testify at the trial in Topeka, and Garrett went with her. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers who had read about the case in the papers. Rebecca sat in the witness chair with her back straight and her chin high, refusing to show any sign of the fear churning in her stomach. "Miss Ellers," the prosecutor said, "please tell the court what happened on the afternoon of May 15th, 1878. Rebecca took a deep breath and began to speak. She told them about the 3 men who had appeared at her homestead. She told them about the demands to sign over her property. She told them about the gunshot that had nearly ended her life, about crawling across the floor in her own blood, about the darkness that had swallowed her as she lay dying on the floor her father had built with his own hands. Her voice shook at times, but she never faltered. She looked directly at the railroad executives sitting at the defendant's table, men in expensive suits who had ordered her death as casually as they might order lunch, and she told the truth without flinching. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Then, slowly, a murmur rose from the spectators. Rebecca could not tell if it was sympathy or outrage or simple shock, but it was powerful enough to make the judge pound his gavel for order. The defense attorney tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting she had misremembered events or exaggerated the danger. But Rebecca stood firm under cross-examination, answering every question with calm precision. "I know what I saw," she said when the attorney suggested she might have confused the attackers with innocent travelers. "I know who shot me, and I know who paid them to do it." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Virgil Hawkins and 2 other executives were sentenced to federal prison. The 3 gunmen received shorter sentences for their cooperation. The railroad was ordered to pay substantial restitution to Rebecca and the other victims of their scheme. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around Rebecca like locusts on a wheat field. Cameras flashed and voices shouted questions. She had become a symbol, the woman who had stood up to a railroad and won, and everyone wanted a piece of her story. "Miss Ellers," one reporter called out above the din, "what do you say to other farmers facing pressure from big corporations?" Rebecca thought for a moment, aware that her words might be printed in newspapers across the country. "I would say do not let them make you feel small," she said finally. "Do not let them convince you that your land, your home, your dreams do not matter just because theirs are bigger." She squared her shoulders. This country was built by people who refused to back down. Do not be the generation that forgets that. The quote was printed in newspapers from Kansas City to San Francisco. But for Rebecca, the greatest moment came later that evening, when she and Garrett were alone in their hotel room. She stood by the window, looking out at the city lights, still trying to process everything that had happened. "We did it," she said softly. "We actually won." Garrett came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "You did it. I just helped." She turned in his arms to face him. "You saved my life. You brought Sullivan and the sheriff. You stood beside me every step of the way." She reached up to touch his face. "I could not have done any of this without you. You could have." Garrett smiled down at her. "You are the strongest person I have ever known, but I am glad you did not have to." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Rebecca felt something loosen in her chest that she had not even known was tight. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long, the fear of loss and betrayal and being alone, finally began to ease its grip. She was not alone anymore, and she never would be again. The wedding was held in the spring of 1879, exactly 1 year after Garrett had found Rebecca bleeding on her cabin floor. The little church in Wilson had never seen such a celebration. Wildflowers decorated every surface, gathered by Rebecca herself from the field she had come to love even more deeply over the past year. Ribbons of blue and white hung from the rafters, fluttering gently in the breeze that came through the open windows. The whole town turned out for the ceremony. Farmers and shopkeepers and townspeople crowded into the small wooden pews, dressed in their Sunday best despite it being a Thursday afternoon. Many of them had faced similar pressure from the railroad, and they saw Rebecca's victory as their own. They had watched her fight and refused to surrender, and they had learned from her courage. Matthew Sullivan served as best man, looking distinctly uncomfortable in a formal suit, but smiling broadly nonetheless. Mrs. Peterson, Rebecca's nearest neighbor and closest friend, stood up with her as matron of honor, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief throughout the ceremony. The preacher, a kindly older man who had known Rebecca's father, kept his remarks brief. But he paused before pronouncing them husband and wife to address the congregation. These two people, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the small church, came together through hardship and adversity. They found each other when they were both wounded and alone, carrying the weight of loss and grief. He looked at Rebecca and Garrett standing before him, their hands clasped, their eyes shining. And instead of letting that darkness define them, they chose to build something beautiful from the ashes. They chose hope over despair, love over fear, togetherness over isolation. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face, but she did not care. Let them see her cry. These were tears of joy, of gratitude, of overwhelming love for the man standing beside her. That is what marriage is about, the preacher continued. Not perfection, but persistence. Not the absence of trouble, but the commitment to face trouble together. Taking two broken pieces and making something whole. Garrett squeezed her hand, and she looked up to see tears glistening in his eyes as well. By the power vested in me by God, and by the state of Kansas, the preacher concluded, I pronounce you husband and wife, and Garrett, you may kiss your bride. He did, thoroughly, long enough that Mrs. Peterson started giggling and Sullivan cleared his throat pointedly. The congregation burst into applause as they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife. Rebecca had never felt so full of joy, so certain that everything in her life had led to this moment. The reception lasted well into the night. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon half the town was dancing on the hard, packed dirt outside the church. There was food in abundance, dishes contributed by every family in the area, and laughter that echoed across the prairie. Garrett proved to be a surprisingly good dancer. He spun Rebecca around the improvised dance floor until she was dizzy and breathless with laughter, then held her close for a slow waltz as the stars came out overhead. Happy, Mrs. Reeves? He murmured against her hair. So happy it scares me a little, she admitted. Good. That means it is real. At some point during the festivities, Sullivan pulled Rebecca aside. I wanted to tell you in person, he said, his expression serious. The railroad has officially abandoned their plans for this route. They announced it 2 days ago. Your land is safe. Rebecca closed her eyes, letting the relief wash over her. After everything, after all the fear and the fighting and the uncertainty, it was finally, truly over. Thank you, she said, opening her eyes to meet his. For everything you have done, I can never repay you. Seeing justice served is payment enough. Sullivan smiled. Your father would be proud of you, Miss Ellers. He paused. Forgive me. Mrs. Reeves, I hope he would be. She found Garrett and told him the news. He whooped with joy and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around while she shrieked with laughter. The guests cheered, not entirely sure what they were celebrating, but happy to join in anyway. We did it, Garrett said, setting her down gently but keeping his arms around her. We actually did it. We did. And then they were kissing again, oblivious to the crowd around them, lost in each other and the magnitude of what they had achieved together. They had fought for their home. They had fought for each other. And they had won. The years that followed were kind to the Reeves family. Garrett sold his cattle business shortly after the wedding and invested the proceeds in the homestead. Together, he and Rebecca expanded the operation, buying adjacent land when it became available, always careful not to overextend themselves, but always looking toward the future. Garrett's experience with cattle proved invaluable as they built a small herd of their own. The Kansas grasslands provided excellent grazing, and before long the Reeves brand was known throughout the county for quality beef. Rebecca's innovative farming techniques, ideas her father had talked about but never lived to implement, produced crop yields that made their neighbors sit up and take notice. But their contributions to the community went far beyond their own property lines. Rebecca established a school on the homestead, a small building near the main house where local children could learn to read and write in cipher. She had never forgotten how her own education had been cut short when her mother died, and she was determined that the children of the frontier would have opportunities she had been denied. She taught them reading and writing and arithmetic, but also botany and history and the importance of standing up for what was right. She told them about the railroad and the trial, about how ordinary people could fight injustice if they refused to give up. Her students adored her. Garrett, meanwhile, became known throughout the county for his fair dealings and sound judgment. When disputes arose between neighbors, people came to him for resolution rather than traveling to the distant county seat. He listened carefully to both sides, asked thoughtful questions, and rendered decisions that people accepted because they trusted his integrity. Eventually, his reputation grew large enough that he was appointed as a county judge. He handled land disputes primarily, using his own experience to understand the complexities of property rights and agricultural life. The railroad companies learned to dread seeing his name on a case because they knew they would not be able to buy or bully their way to victory. Their first child, a son, arrived in the spring of 1880. They named him William after Rebecca's father, and from his first breath he seemed determined to make his presence known. He came into the world squalling and red-faced, with his mother's stubborn chin and his father's serious eyes. Garrett cried when he held his son for the first time. Rebecca pretended not to notice, but she never let him forget it. A daughter followed 2 years later. They named her Emma, after Garrett's mother, the woman who had sung hymns while she worked and taught her son to be gentle and kind. Emma had her father's easy smile and her mother's quick mind, and she wrapped both parents around her tiny finger from the moment she arrived. The farmhouse that Rebecca's father had built with his own hands grew and changed over the years. Garrett added rooms as the family expanded, always careful to match the original construction, always respectful of the foundation that William Ellers had laid. A proper kitchen replaced the cramped cooking area. A second story provided bedrooms for the growing children. A wide porch wrapped around 3 sides, perfect for sitting in the evenings and watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and rose. In 1885, the railroad finally came to Wilson, but it came on different terms than Southern Pacific had intended. The scandals surrounding that company's tactics had forced changes across the industry. New regulations required fair negotiations with landowners. Independent surveyors prevented the manipulation of property boundaries. The court stood ready to intervene if companies tried to return to their old ways. The railroad that came to Wilson was the Union Pacific, and they negotiated in good faith. The Reeves family sold a small corner of their property, land they did not need and had not developed, for a grain depot that would serve the entire community. The price was fair, and the depot brought prosperity to farmers throughout the region. Rebecca watched the first train pull into the Wilson station with complicated emotions. She thought about all the pain the railroad had caused her, the bullet wound that still ached on cold mornings, the terror of those months when she did not know if she would live or die. But she also thought about progress, about change, about the way the world moved forward, whether you wanted it to or not. The key was not to resist all change, but to ensure that change happened on fair terms, to fight for justice without fighting against the future itself. Garrett stood beside her on the platform as the train rumbled past, his hand warm and solid in hers. "Strange to think how different things might have been," he said quietly. Strange indeed. But Rebecca did not dwell on might-have-beens. She had learned long ago that the only direction worth looking was forward. The children grew strong and capable in the wholesome environment of the Reeves farm. William had his father's height and his mother's determination. He grew up hearing stories of the railroad trial, of how his mother had stood in that Topeka courtroom and stared down the men who had tried to kill her. Those stories shaped him in ways that would not become apparent until he was older. He studied law under Matthew Sullivan's guidance, traveling to Topeka for summers during his teenage years to learn the profession from a man he had come to admire deeply. Sullivan taught him not just the letter of the law, but its spirit. Not just how to win cases, but why some cases were worth fighting even when winning seemed impossible. When William finished his education, he returned to Wilson. He could have gone anywhere, could have made his fortune in the growing cities of the East, but he chose to come home. He opened a small practice and dedicated himself to representing farmers and small landowners against the corporate interests that still tried to take advantage of them. He was his mother's son in more ways than one. Emma took a different path, but one equally meaningful. She inherited Rebecca's love of teaching and expanded upon it in ways her mother had never imagined. After completing her education at the normal school in Topeka, she did not return to Wilson to take over her mother's small schoolhouse. Instead, she traveled. She went to remote communities throughout the territory, places so isolated that children had never seen a book or held a pencil. She established schools in sod houses and converted barns, in church basements and general stores. She trained local women to continue teaching after she moved on, creating a network of education that spread across the prairie like wildfire. Her students went on to become doctors and lawyers and farmers and teachers themselves. Every one of them could trace their success back to a woman who refused to let geography limit their futures. Through droughts and blizzards, through good years and lean ones, Rebecca and Garrett faced each challenge together. There were seasons when the crops failed and they had to tighten their belts. There were winters so harsh that they lost half their cattle and wondered if they would survive until spring. There were moments of grief and fear and uncertainty, but there was never a moment when they faced any of it alone. That was the secret, Rebecca realized as the years passed. Not that life became easier, but that burdens became lighter when shared. Not that troubles disappeared, but that they shrank when confronted together. She watched her husband age with a love that only deepened with time. The dark hair she remembered from that first day turned gray and then white. The face that had been young and uncertain when he found her bleeding on the cabin floor became lined and weathered by years of sun and wind and laughter. But his eyes remained the same, those steady, kind, honest eyes that had looked at her on that terrible night and seen something worth saving. She knew her own face had changed just as much. The mirror showed her a woman marked by time, hair faded to silver, skin softened by age. But when Garrett looked at her, she still felt like the young woman who had stood on her porch with a shotgun, refusing to let anyone take what was hers. That is the thing about real love, she thought. It does not see the years, it sees the person underneath, the one who was always there and always will be. The homestead that Rebecca had once defended alone became a gathering place for family and friends and neighbors. Holidays brought William and his wife and their 3 sons, Emma and her husband and their 2 daughters, grandchildren who filled the house with noise and chaos and joy. On those occasions, Rebecca would sometimes slip away to stand on the porch and look out at the land her father had dreamed of, the land she had nearly died for, the land that had given her everything she had ever wanted. She would think about her parents, both gone now to whatever waited beyond this life. She would think about Garrett's family, the brother and mother and father he had lost so long ago. She hoped they were watching, wherever they were. She hoped they were proud. And then Garrett would come find her, drawn by some invisible thread that connected them even after all these years. He would slip his arm around her waist and pull her close, and they would stand together in the fading light, watching their legacy unfold before them. On the 10th anniversary of the day, Garrett found Rebecca wounded in her cabin. They stood together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. William was chasing Emma through the garden, both of them shrieking with laughter despite being far too old for such games. The setting sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and orange, just as it had on that terrible, wonderful evening so long ago. "Any regrets?" Rebecca asked, leaning into her husband's embrace. "About giving up the trail for this life?" Garrett's arms tightened around her, pulling her closer. "Not a single one." He was quiet for a moment, watching his children, thinking about all the roads he had not taken, all the trails he had left unwandered, all the freedom he had surrendered when he chose to stay on this homestead with this woman. "This land gave me everything I never knew I wanted," he said finally. "A home, a family, a purpose." He turned her gently to face him, tilting her chin up so he could look into her eyes. "And you, Rebecca Reeves, you gave me a heart I did not know I was missing." Rebecca smiled up at him, feeling the love that had only grown stronger with every passing year. "And to think it all started with a gunshot. And a woman too stubborn to die," Garrett added with a grin. "And a cowboy who stopped the bleeding and held my hand through the darkest night." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a promise renewed after 10 years of keeping it. "I would do it all again," he murmured against her lips. "Every moment, every hardship, every battle. If it meant ending up here with you, I would choose this life 1,000 times over. So would I." They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon, watching their children's laughter echo across the land they had fought so hard to keep. The same land where Rebecca's father was buried on the hill overlooking the north pasture. The same land where William and Emma would someday bring their own children to play. A legacy built from stubbornness and courage and love. "Mama!" Emma called, running toward the porch with grass stains on her dress and a firefly cupped in her hands. "Papa, come see what I caught." Garrett looked at Rebecca with a question in his eyes. She smiled. "Let us go." Hand in hand, they walked down the porch steps and into the yard where their children were waiting. The first stars were beginning to appear, the same stars that had watched over them since the very beginning, and somewhere Rebecca knew her father was watching too. Smiling, proud of everything she had become, everything she had built, everything she had fought for, and won. The story of Rebecca and Garrett Reeves became legend in Wilson County. People told it to their children and grandchildren, pointing out the homestead that still stood strong after all those years. They talked about the woman who had faced down a railroad, and the man who had saved her life, and the love that had grown between them in the midst of danger and fear. It was a story about courage, about standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible. It was a story about love, about finding someone worth fighting for and choosing to stay when walking away would have been easier. It was a story about home, about the places we build and the people we build them with and the legacies we leave behind. Rebecca died peacefully in 1905, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, with Garrett holding her hand just as he had on that first night so many years ago. Garrett followed her 3 months later, unable or unwilling to live in a world without her. They were buried side by side on the hill overlooking the north pasture, next to William Ellers, the man whose dream had started it all. 3 headstones, marking 3 dreamers who had seen something in this Kansas prairie worth fighting for. The inscription on Rebecca's stone read simply, "She stood her ground." Garrett's read, "He found his home." And between them, a smaller stone marked the place where their love had grown. Together they built a legacy. Generations later, their descendants still gather at the farmhouse for holidays and anniversaries. They tell the old stories and marvel at how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. The railroad still runs through Wilson, carrying goods and passengers across the country. But it runs around the Reeves property now, leaving that original homestead untouched. A tribute to a woman who would not be moved. And on summer evenings, when the sun sets in shades of gold and orange and the fireflies begin to emerge, some say you can still see 2 figures sitting on the porch of the old cabin. An auburn-haired woman and a tall man with broad shoulders, holding hands as they watch the stars come out. Their story endures, a reminder that courage can overcome fear, that love can grow from the darkest moments. And that home is not a place. It is a person, someone worth fighting for, someone worth staying for, someone worth everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.